Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Australia Council Amendment Creative Australia Bill 2023, which I will refer to as the Creative Australia Bill. This, I understand, is the first in a series of bills that will implement the government's National Cultural Policy Revive, announced on 30th of January this year. So I will save the majority of my remarks on the policy itself for a later time. I note only that on first glance it offers nothing, if in fact very little, for the people of Flinders, whose arts and cultural activity remains beyond the remit of the Australia Council, or indeed public funding through Regional Arts Victoria, as we are not considered regional, but for very small civil slivers of the peninsula where our cultural bodies tend not to be resident. The Australia Council is the vehicle by which the government intends to implement the National Cultural Policy. This bill provides for the Australia Council to operate under the name Creative Australia as an interim measure. It is, in that respect, the beginning of a rebranding exercise for the Australia Council for the Arts, which has been known as such since it was established by the Right Honourable Harold Holt, Liberal Prime Minister of Australia, when he rose in this place on 1 November 1967, albeit a bit further down the hill, and he said, "I wish to inform the House of two decisions by government and a number of other developments in the field of cultural activities. The government, for some time, has been actively considering ways to increase, at a national level, Commonwealth patronage of the arts without creating a monolithic structure which could inhibit the free play of our cultural interests and enthusiasms at all levels. For some years now, government encouragement for the arts in general has been increasing, and we feel that financial aid properly directed on the best advice is one significant area where the Commonwealth Government can provide material assistance. We need to ensure that we have a system for giving financial assistance which takes full account of the important role played not only by state governments but by municipal elections and a host of professional and amateur organisations throughout the country. With this in mind, the government, in its first decision on cultural activities, has decided to establish an Australian Council for the Arts to be its financial agent and advisor on the performing arts and other activities connected with the arts in general. Thus began the life of the Australia Council for the Arts, which has continued in more or less the same form, under the same name, for over 50 years. I had the great pleasure of serving on the Board of Council for 6 of those years, and I recognise here the remarkable people with whom I served, both on that board and across the Council's leadership, who deserve our gratitude for the dynamic state in which our cultural sector finds itself after the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic. I particularly recognise Adrian Collette, CEO, Tim Blackwell, Executive Director of Corporate Resources, who worked so closely with Dr Stephen Arnott, Deputy Secretary, Creative Economy and the Arts, whose partnership and tireless work helped to sustain the Australian cultural sector through those dark years. More meaningfully, this bill merges Creative Partnerships Australia with the Australia Council, soon to be Creative Australia. Creative Partnerships Australia was created by the Rudd Labor government under the stewardship of arts enthusiast and former Labor leader of Simon Crean back in 2013. Its establishment followed a thorough review of private sector support for the arts undertaken by Harold Mitchell. At that time, it brought together two independent yet successful bodies focused on arts philanthropy, the Australian Business Arts Foundation and Arts Support. Its inaugural CEO, who remains CEO to this day, is Ms Fiona Menzies, who brought to that role a successful career in arts administration and leadership in arts policy at the national level. Under the leadership of Ms Menzies and a remarkable lineup of directors engaged across arts and culture in Australia, Creative Partnerships has been extremely effective in its task of raising philanthropic support for the arts. In its last financial year, it raised almost $10 million from over 9,000 individual donors. In its first year, it raised less than $1 million. It is worth noting its peak fundraising achievements occurred in a COVID-affected year. The CPA staff are experts in arts fundraising. The sector has benefited enormously from their independence from the government's funding priorities and processes. In addition, they have provided a vital and impartial source of advice to the sector with local presences in most capital cities. It is proposed that these functions be absorbed by the Australia Council. It's worth noting briefly here that the Council tried its hand at philanthropic activity in the past without resounding success. In my time on the board, a co-investment subcommittee...
The member for Flinders will resume their seat. It being 6:30 p.m, the debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. The member for Flinders will have leave to continue speaking when the debate is resumed on a future day.
Goodness, sorry about all that kerfuffle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. in continuation from yesterday, it is proposed that the functions be absorbed by the Australia Council, now to be known as Creative Australia. It is worth noting briefly here that the Australia Council has tried its hand at philanthropic activity in the past, without, one might say, resounding success. In my time on the board, a co-investment subcommittee eventually dissipated, both in terms of activity and focus, but for the Venice Biennale, which has engaged broadly and successfully across Australia's philanthropic community to mount extremely successful exhibitions at the Australian Pavilion since the 1980s. However, this has usually been done by setting up a committee external to Council to undertake the huge 2-year fundraising task, as well as the design of bespoke programs offered to recognise donors and supporters alike. These are not the usual, nor may it be said necessarily comfortable tasks for public servants engaged by the Australia Council who discharge their functions with accountability to the sector, but also to the taxpayer. The bill suggests all employees of Creative Partnerships Australia, but for the CEO, will be transferred to Creative Australia. But it is not clear yet whether the state capital city-based offices of Creative Partnerships currently located in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane will be retained. Those offices provide a low-cost local link to Creative Partnerships Australia for arts organisations and artists nationwide, something from which the Australia Council for the Arts could benefit, given that it is solely headquartered in inner Sydney. It is important to recognise those who have contributed to the success of Creative Partnerships Australia, the board, which has included Catherine Walter, Dan Rosen, Natasha Bowness, Roisin Garnon, Leonard Very, Carol Schwartz, Samantha Mears and the great Rupert Meyer, but also to thank all of those who have donated through CPA and made a real difference to arts and culture in this country. The amendments will require Creative Australia to deliver the functions of Creative Partnerships Australia, including the attraction and recognition of public and private sector support for and philanthropic and private investment in the arts, and undertake research on public and private sector investment. There is indeed some crossover with a new approach recently established by the Meyer Foundation in partnership with the Sydney Meyer Fund, Tim Fairfax family and the Ian Potter Foundation, among others. A new approach, led by my former colleague on the Australia Council board, Kate Fielding, undertakes magnificent research in and around Australian culture. I highly recommend it. So in essence, the great loss from this change will be the disappearance of a dedicated entity focused on the delicate and, for many in the public sector, sometimes daunting task of philanthropy. The transfer will bring together private arts philanthropy and public arts funding within the one entity, the cultures of which are quite distinct and not always compatible. It will be interesting to see how the new philanthropic arm of Creative Australia is established and operated, so as to not lose the remarkable energy and activity around private support for the arts and culture, which has been an element of cultural endeavour since the beginning of time. Till then, I wish those involved patience and courage with the transition.